Hi, and welcome to our return from spring break. We're going to cover Southwest Asia and the rise of Islam. Now, why do I not say the Middle East? Well, we'll get to that in just a minute here. But first, terms. Islam is a monotheistic religion based upon divine revelation to the Prophet Muhammad. It's usually encapsulated in the Quran, but not all of Islam is derived from the Quran. Some of it is derived from other books, including the Hadith and the Surah. These are sayings and traditions of the Prophet that fill in the gaps that the Quran kind of leaves empty. The Caliph is the person who succeeds the Prophet. It is a religious political leader who, at least in theory, leads the Islamic community. The reality is, however, that sometimes they lead, and there's often rebellions within their borders or within the community of the believers, and their power is not absolute. Often people talk about the Caliph as a kind of autocratic ruler, and that really isn't true at all. Some very strong caliphs are able to get things done, especially in later dynasties, but by and large, the caliph's power is limited to whatever territory he controls. Nonetheless, he is still considered the successor to the Prophet by the majority of Muslims. Schism is what happens when religions divide, usually very acrimoniously, and that's true what happens in Islam as well. That almost immediately after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there is a schism between the Sunni, which is the majority of the Muslims, which adhere to the tradition or the precedents of Islam. Literally meaning the habit or the tradition or the way things have always been done. Sunni represents the majority of Muslims, around about, if I were to ballpark, about 80% of Muslims. Now the other side of the schism is the Shiite Ali, or the Shia. The Shiite Ali, meaning the party of Ali or the faction of Ali, is a minority sect of Islam, and they differ in a lot of Islamic interpretations, and they have a lot of different traditions from the Sunni, which I won't go into in this lecture, and that your book will cover a little bit better. If you want anything more in depth, I encourage you to take a history of Islam or a history of a history of the Middle East in general. So the Shiite Ali are the minority. They are, if I were to ballpark again, about 18% or so of the total amount of Muslims in any given period. Now, with any ballpark, there are periods when there are more, say, for instance, more Shia than normal or more Sunni than normal. So this is just a ballpark average to give you an idea of the difference between the two. Often there's a false parallel drawn between, say, Catholic and Protestant, and that's not really what's going on here. It is closer, if I were to be generous, it was closer to the schism between the Latin Catholic Church and the Orthodox Catholic Church. So before we go too far into depth about those types of schisms, let's move on. And this is the modern Middle East, and see, the Middle East has a very difficult geographical boundaries. Some people include Sudan and Mauritania in the Middle East, although they are absolutely in Africa, and others include Afghanistan or even Pakistan into the Middle East, which again problematizes this area. That's why I put Middle East in quotation marks. And often saying somebody's from the Middle East is usually conflated with Muslim and conflated with Arab. Not all people from the Middle East are Arab. Not all Muslims are from the Middle East. In fact, there are Turks, there are Persians who are Muslim, who are Christian, who are Jews. There are Arabs who are Jews and Christians as well. So it's a very difficult set of categories. And I try to leave the term Middle East out of the way. That's why I say Southwest Asia. When I was in graduate school, I used to jokingly refer to this particular area as quote-unquote that place, because in one of my papers I argued that it was about as accurate a term as the term Middle East. Now, so where does the term Middle East come from? Well, it's actually from 18th and 19th century English scholars who referred to it as the kind of middle point between home, which is the British Isles, and the East, or Orient, which is India and Pakistan, and then, of course, China as well. So it's in between West and East, so therefore it gets to be the Middle East. Before we go too much further, I want to set the stage for the rise and advent of Islam. Now we have two empires. First, we have the Byzantines, the medieval Romans. They are the vestiges of the Roman Empire that we studied a few weeks back. They are majority Christian. They are fairly rich, but they are declining in the face of Persian invasions. And although on this map I show a nice big purpley swath, they lose a lot of territory, particularly in Egypt and in North Africa. And, of course, by the time we get to the middle of the 7th century, they've lost even a lot of territory in Anatolia. At least at first, the Byzantines are obsessed with reclaiming Rome and some of these lost western territories from the Germanic tribes that are trying to emulate the fallen Roman Empire. To the Byzantines, these newcomers are pretenders to the throne, and they are sullying the Roman name. They are invaders. So sometimes you get the Byzantines controlling a little bit of territory in the Italian peninsula, but they don't ever really control a lot of it for any particularly long time. Now, on the other hand, we have the Sassanids. They are the Persians. They are mostly Zoroastrian at this point. They are also rich, and they are expending at the expense of the Byzantines. As you see here, they've taken away a lot of territory, and they are obsessed with eclipsing the legendary Achaemenid Persians, those Persians that had produced Xerxes and Darius and Cyrus the Great. So an attempt to reclaim more territory than had been initially administered by the archaic Persians was their main goal. Here is where the poor Byzantine Empire is left. The Byzantines are really on the ropes at this point. When we get to about 655, the Byzantines are really, really hurting. So this is the world in which the Arabians find themselves. Before we go any further, we have to understand the geography influence upon the majority of the society in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula is incredibly dry. It receives less than 8 inches of rain in a year. To put that in contrast, Boston alone has received over this winter over 10 times that amount in snowfall, just to let you know. So that gives you an idea of just how little rain there is falling. And this is not an even distribution. Lots of times that rain that falls typically falls on the coast where it hits mountains, where the temperature is cooler. There are no major rivers in the Arabian Peninsula, and less than 2% of the land can sustain crops. In the United States, somewhere around 14 to 18% of the territory of the United States can sustain crops. We have frequent dust storms in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, and there are extreme temperature swings. In the summer, the average daily temperature tops out around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and average winter nightly temperature often dips well below freezing. So I want you to consider the environment that has little or no fresh water. There is wells, there are oases, but not major freshwater resources. So there's no rivers, no lakes, that sort of thing. So there's no real fresh water available on the surface. There's extreme temperature variances and harsh geological features. What would you think would be next to impossible to accomplish in such an environment? And when I ask this question, I want you to think back to ancient Egypt and Greece and China and India. What do they all have that the Arabian Peninsula does not have? What kind of life would be most sustainable in the Arabian Peninsula? Because I will tell you, humans will occupy pretty much any place they can on this globe and will put up with almost any kind of weather situations and are very stubborn about moving. So what would be the most sustainable life style that you could find? If you said a nomadic lifestyle, you were very much on the money. The nomadic lifestyle of the majority of the Arab society is called Bedouin. Bedouin literally means the person who is from the empty places. They moved around in search of new pastures and water sources. Now, not all, of course, not all of Arab society did this, but the majority enough did that this became the predominant culture. The importance of the camel in this setting cannot be underestimated. The camel was imported from East Asia from around the Gobi Desert around 1000 BCE and took off there. It became an absolute necessity to the point that when the Old Testament talks about Abraham, they say he was so rich, he had so many camels, he had all these camels. The problem is that when Abraham was alive, or would have been alive, there were no camels. But they were so integral and such a symbol of wealth that when the Old Testament was finally codified, one of the things that the Jews or the Israelis in the Babylonian captivity did was to say that we were from a very wealthy, very well-to-do background, a very blessed people. And so they looked around and they saw that the wealthy people had camels, and they immediately assumed that that Abraham would have had camels as well. It's kind of the equivalent of if, say, 1,000 years from now, our descendants are telling their children that George Washington was so wealthy that he had 100 Cadillacs in his backyard. So it's kind of a weird situation, but you got to imagine that at this point, most of society is illiterate. In fact, pre-Islamic society is also illiterate. They rely mostly on oral histories and mythologies to convey the mores and the necessities of their societies. Now, the societies are assembled mostly in close-knit family groups called clans. And those clans are often associated into larger units called tribes. These are groups of clans that have gotten together to mutually benefit each other. Clans, you can think of your family reunion as being the clan. All of your extended relatives, your cousins, your uncles, your aunts, your grandparents, and all these sort of people. Those are your clan. Even the cousin 3 times removed on your mother's side, that is part of your clan. Now together, you guys can accomplish a lot if you had to. And then when your clan gets together with another clan, imagine how much more you can accomplish. So clans and tribes are the majority of Arab society at this point. Now, there are some Bedouin traditions that are important to understand. There's the protection of family, and honor is the highest priority in Bedouin Arab society. When the family is threatened, you want to protect your family. And if you can't protect your family, somehow it affects your honor and your sense of self. And in a society where you really don't have a lot of possessions, and you really don't have a lot of luxury, your honor is pretty much the only thing you have going for you. That's the only way you can distinguish yourself from others. You don't have a lot of land. Nobody really owns the interior of the Arabian Peninsula. You don't have a lot of property, although, to be fair, there were very, very poor members of the tribe and very, very rich members of the tribe. But by and large, compared to settled societies, you didn't have quite as much. So the need to protect your family and your honor becomes the highest priority. This leads to a kind of informal, I don't want to say justice system, but more of a vengeance system called blood feuds. These are ways in which society controlled and punished bad behavior and wrongdoings. An example of a blood feud might be your sister is raped by a man from another tribe. You go to avenge your sister by killing him. That other tribe is upset at you for killing him, and so they send somebody after you. You get killed, and your uncle decides that he's going to avenge your death, and that's a blood feud. Because there is no impartial arbitration, like a king or a court or a sheriff or something like that, to impartially administer a standardized codified law, you have a spiraling blood feud that seems to never end. Now, the flip side of blood feuds is guests. Guests who come who are either invited in or who are, say, perhaps found by the tribe, are often treated to the best of everything. What do I mean by found by the tribe? Let's say, for instance, you were in pre-Islamic society and you were lost in the desert. Some tribes, when they found you, they would take care of you and they would give you the best medicine that they had. They would try to mend your wounds as best they could. In fact, it leads to generosity to a fault, to the point where even today, if you go to the Middle East, you will find that people there will give you the best of everything, even if it means that they go without themselves. So it's a generosity to a fault, because to say no to a guest is to insult them, to tell them that your honor isn't, or that your generosity has limits, that you have no concept of a boundless honor. And of course, at the heart of all of this is the idea of caring for the weakest member of your society. And that's seen as a point of honor, because if you think about it, you're really just an injury away, or maybe an old age injury away from being an invalid. And so if you don't take care of your grandmother, then what kind of example are you setting for your grandchildren? That sort of thing. Control of water is important. No, it's actually vital for the survival of your tribe. Water is life in the desert. And in the mythology of Bedouin traditions, there are a lot of gods and spirits. Some of these inhabit waterways, some of them inhabit oases, some can give and take away that water. And so water is not just a way of life, it's also a way to display power for your tribe, because not only do you have access to the water, but you also have access to these spirits who could possibly work on your behalf. Now, some pre-Islamic Bedouins do convert to other religions, including monotheistic religions like Judaism and Christianity, or dualist religions like Zoroastrianism. When somebody died in most Bedouin society, in non-Christian, non-Jewish Bedouin society, if you died, that was it. You were over. There was no loyalty to a dead person anymore. There was no point. They can do nothing for you, so you can do nothing for them. Your tie is severed. It's largely because the pre-Islamic belief that there was not really a life after death. This is not unusual in some societies, that there is nothing beyond death. Now, most societies, especially settled societies, do believe that there is something beyond death, some kind of afterlife, whether it's the Egyptian afterlife or the Chinese afterlife, or the Roman concept of the fields of Elysium, or the Scandinavian concept of Valhalla, or whatever. Pre-Islamic mythology included things like genies. Now, according to pre-Islamic mythology, God didn't stop at just forming humans out of clay. He also formed other beings out of other elements as well. Now, humans, because they are very solid, we are kind of the people of the earth. We are visible all the time. We are relatively stable. God created these other forms of life as well out of other elements. A good example would be jinn, that are made out of air, hence we get the name genies. And then, of course, there are creatures made out of fire that are referred to as ifrit. They are also mortal as well. They have lives. They have different lifespans than humans do, but they are very much human-like. They can be good and evil in equal measure, and sometimes they are very alien to understand. The old mythology of genies being trapped inside of items, and that they grant boons to people who release them or who do favors for them, leads to this belief in wishes being granted to people. But wishes in and of themselves also have a life lesson, or maybe a parable kind of thing. You've all heard, I'm sure, of the old axiom, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. Often these tales especially in pre-Islamic Arabia, surrounding jinn, have somebody receiving a wish. Usually it's only just one wish, because I mean that's pretty powerful. You receive that one wish, and when you wish for it, it turns out to have a side effect that you didn't exactly anticipate. For example, you may wish to become the sheikh of a tribe, the leader of a tribe. And when you do, maybe a couple of days later, you're assassinated by a jealous lover or something like that, or something horrible happens to you. And then the moral of the story, of course, is that just be happy with what you have. Don't try to reach too far, and definitely don't mess with things that are beyond your sight. Genies and ifrits are often they often pull pranks on humans because humans are relatively slow. They're very visible. They don't turn invisible like genies and ifrits do, and so they have this kind of almost a nasty reputation, a malicious reputation, like leprechauns do. Now, there's an exception to this Bedouin society. That is the pre-Islamic cities. There are several kingdoms which were established along the coastline of the peninsula, and these are good places to establish small kingdoms. And they're a little bit cooler temperature-wise. They have access to seaborne trade routes. They on average have a little bit more rainfall, and they can be culturally diverse. Often there are trade routes that pass through the major cities of these kingdoms, allowing people to cultivate tax bases and to generate trade, and they are unfortunately subject to invasion. A good example of this is the Achaemenid Persians that I mentioned earlier in the lecture had invaded part of Arabia, and they had taken some of the major cities and threw down some of the more affluent kingdoms in the north. When Alexander the Great came through and collapsed that Achaemenid Persian Empire, the Bedouins kind of adopted him as a savior figure or a liberator figure, to the point where later on in the Quran he actually makes an appearance, or references to him make an appearance. There is a certain surah, which is a passage in the Quran that mentions Zul Qarnayn, or the two-horned one, which everybody automatically knows is Alexander the Great. And in it, it says that God reveals to Muhammad that the power to conquer the world was granted to Alexander in order to, quote, protect God's people. And that Alexander built this great iron wall to keep out the demons of the north, the Gog and the Magog, and that he went to the ends of the earth to essentially subjugate all the evil demons and make the world safe for humanity. But the Persians weren't the only ones who invaded. The Ethiopians and the Romans. And let me give you an example. So, for instance, in 575 of the current era, the Sassanid Persians invaded Arabia. They seized control of what is now modern-day Yemen and Oman, partly because they wanted control of some of the seaborne trade. They already had control of a good chunk of the portion of the Silk Road that passed through much of their territory, but they also wanted to capture some of that seaborne trade as well. And partly it was because the Arabians, the Bedouins themselves, had a habit of raiding caravans, trade caravans, especially those that were headed into Sassanid Persia. Well, if you can stop the raids on your caravan, you increase your profits. You can also then direct the raids to further erode Byzantine control in Syria, and that is exactly what happens. Tribute is paid to the Sassanids by most of the Arab tribes, including the Qurayshi tribe, who we'll get to in a little bit. The Qurayshi are in charge of Mecca. This essentially secures the southern flank, which allows Persia to capture Syria and Egypt away from the Byzantines. So here we have the Arabian Peninsula. There are a lot of invasions and influences in the Arabian Peninsula. You have the Sassanids who come in and take over a lot of territory, particularly in the east and the south. But you also have invasions from Ethiopia. And in fact, the invasions of Ethiopia into the Arabian Peninsula are the last time that the Ethiopians, or that any African power, would project itself overseas. There was also an invasion by the Byzantine Romans at some points. There's influence from Chinese traders and Indian traders as well. All in all, trade and invasion exposed the Arabians to a lot of different ideas and a lot of different philosophies. The result, by the time we get to 655, is this. The Arabian Peninsula is largely dominated by the Sassanid Persians. So by 651, it seems if you were an alien, if you were to lay bets, you would say the Persians are going to squash the Byzantines, and there is no real threat coming from the mostly empty Arabian Peninsula. Now, two of the major cities that are important to Islam are Mecca and Medina, or at the time it was called Yathrib. Mecca is a center of trade for the eastern portion of the peninsula. Now, although it isn't directly on the ocean, it is close enough to a port that it has a very attractive position on the Red Sea. That access to the Red Sea allows it to tap into the terminus of the seaborne Silk Road, as well as the interior incense trade routes. As a result, the Qurayshi tribe begins to build a lot of shrines and temples to a variety of gods. At one point, by the time the Prophet Muhammad is born, there's about 300 shrines within the city of Mecca. Now, one of the reasons why you want to put shrines up is if you have merchants from all these different lands and they believe very devoutly in their gods, and they want to make a proper sacrifice or maybe a proper pilgrimage or a proper prayer to their gods to make sure that they have a safe voyage and a bountiful harvest or a great profitable trade or something like that, then you will attract a lot more people to your city. That leads to extreme wealth for the Qurayshi tribe. Now, the Qurayshi tribe had at one point been Bedouin, but in the early part of the 7th century, they had taken control of Mecca, and as a result, the flow of wealth allowed them to become extremely wealthy. They also afforded protection for trade routes on the interior. Now, comparatively, if we go to a little further north on the Arabian Peninsula, we meet with Yathrib, which would later become known as Medina. Literally, Medina al-Rasul, the city of the Prophet, but we'll get to that in a little bit. It's further north along the peninsula, so it's a little bit more removed from the Red Sea trade routes. It's also a little bit more arable soil, so that it's able to produce crops in reliable amounts, and has even more reliable rainfall. It has access to a lot more water than Mecca does. And so, although it isn't close to the trade routes, it is able to trade its goods and its services for commodities that it needs. Unlike Mecca, Yathrib is controlled by a coalition of tribes that are often at loggerheads with each other. So let's look at Mecca directly. Mecca is the city into which the Prophet Muhammad is born. And there's a divide between the rich and poor, which becomes increasingly obvious as the 6th century and 7th century rolls on. The luxuries and stability afforded by the immense wealth that is coming into the city is concentrated in smaller and smaller hands, or fewer and fewer hands, I should say. And they're no longer interdependent upon each other for their survival. Compared to those in the interior, even a powerful sheikh in the interior still had to rely on people providing him food, and so there was a more personal relationship. Once you're in the city, however, food seems to come from all sorts of sources, and you're not as dependent upon each other. The result is that the abject poverty of the poor is seen as a personal failing rather than as a shortcoming of honor for the wealthy Qurayshi tribe. The poor are seen as lazy or parasites upon society, and they are often subject to all sorts of abuses, and that includes neglect, ridicule, or even worse, sometimes summary execution. And this was applied to those who were sick or disabled, who were insane or maybe developmentally challenged. developmentally challenged, elderly, orphans, and others, all of whom were subject to, or could theoretically be subject to, some of these abuses. The making of money becomes the sole focus of the Qurayshi tribe, and ensuring that money continues to flow unabated into Mecca is important to the Qurayshis. Muhammad himself is born in 570 of the current era, but his father dies before he's actually born. His mother dies shortly thereafter when Muhammad's about 6. The relationship between orphans and Medinan society is usually pretty harsh. Those who are without protection are often either kicked outside of the city into a very harsh environment where they either become part of an outlaw band or a criminal organization, or in some cases, in many cases, where they starve to death. Muhammad is lucky. He has a grandfather who happens to love his mother very much. And when his mother passes away, his grandfather realizes that he needs to prove that Muhammad is not a drain upon the Qurayshi tribe resources, and essentially gets him apprenticed to a traveling merchant caravan. This is both to protect the child, but also to teach him a trade. And you can imagine that at 6 years old, his grandfather's essentially sending him to business school to learn how to conduct businesses and how to do math and gauging prices and assessing quality and that sort of thing. Over time, Muhammad gains a reputation for being an honest and charitable and pious individual. He's not unusual, but he's rare in Meccan society in that he prays to one God. He prays to Allah, which is seen as, at this point in history, as a kind of king of gods, like Odin or Zeus would have been. And at 25 years old, he's very prosperous, and he has this really great sterling reputation. Every time when he comes back to Mecca, he doesn't party, he doesn't debauch himself. Instead, he lives rather simply, giving charity, and most importantly, going to pray in the wilderness outside of Mecca. Now, by the time he gets to 25, he's changed employers a couple of times. His grandfather has died, and his uncle, his mother's brother, has taken over the family business. But Muhammad is working for a woman by the name of Khadijah. And Khadijah is a really, really interesting character. Khadijah in pre-Islamic society was typical of the wealthy elite women. She had a lot of respect. She was able to conduct business in her own right. She had political influence, and of course she owned property. Now, Khadijah married into a lot of this wealth. When she was young, she married a much, much older merchant. It was one of these arranged marriages where when she was about 15 years old, she was married to somebody who was in his 50s or 60s. He died when she was relatively young, and she never really remarried. She used her husband's fortune and her own to continue to expand her business. And she fell in love with Muhammad, liked his reputation. At the time Muhammad was 25, she was about 40, so she's totally being a cougar at this point. And at one point, as her employer, she even ordered him to marry her, and he said, "No, I can't possibly do this. There's no way I can marry you." But eventually they do get married, and it seems to be a real love match, because in pre-Islamic society, a wealthy man, and usually only men, could marry as many women as they wanted, but Muhammad never married another woman while Khadijah was alive. Now, Muhammad, as I mentioned before, was an honest merchant who always kept his word. It garners him this stellar reputation, so he is considered a paragon of Arab society at this time. He is troubled, according to his own recollections in the Surah and the Hadith. He was troubled by Meccan society and the way that they favored wealth and comfort over taking care of the poor, and sought refuge as he prays in a cave. When he meditates upon the injustice of the world and how can he fix this problem of the world, he allegedly receives a message from God via the archangel Gabriel. The revelation in the Quran says that he felt a presence in the cave, and then he felt as if he was gripped by iron bands and felt his life being squeezed out of him, and he only heard the single word recite, to which Muhammad said, "I don't know what you're talking about." The bands grip him harder, and eventually the words flow out of him, La illa Allah, and it's, there is no God but God. There's only one God. Initially he thinks he's tricked, or going insane, maybe being tricked by a genie, and so he runs home to Khadijah and hides under his bed, of course. You know, that's what I would do if I was being pursued by a genie. And eventually he's calmed down by Khadijah, and Khadijah offers him some help, says, I have a cousin who studies supernatural phenomena. He knows about the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible and the Zoroastrian texts, and so they consult this cousin, who then confirms that what Muhammad felt is similar to the revelations that that Abraham and that Moses felt, and that other prophets had felt as well. It's the presence of Gabriel and God speaking through Gabriel. So Muhammad stops being a merchant and begins to preach a new monotheistic religion in Mecca. Now, there's a problem with this, of course. He's saying that all other gods in the city with 300 shrines are false gods. So this garners him a lot of attention, the bad variety, from the Qurayshi tribe. Muhammad is in trouble very soon after beginning to preach about Islam. His grandfather had died when he was younger, but his family is led by an uncle who loves him like a son. The Qurayshi tribes demands that Muhammad stops preaching monotheism, especially in the streets where he's haranguing people. One of the reasons why is he's disrupting trade. He's making it uncomfortable for people to do their ceremonies or make their offerings to their gods. When Muhammad refuses, in fact, he said to his uncle, they could put the sun in one hand and the moon in another hand, and I would still not stop preaching about Islam. In other words, they could offer me everything in the world, and I still wouldn't stop. So when Muhammad refuses, the Qurayshi tribe demands that the uncle basically kick him out of the tribe, kick him out of the clan that he was in, and this would leave him without protection, and the Qurayshi tribe could then kill him. Well, killing him would stop the message. He's had a lot of traction with the very, very poor of Islam, but not very much traction with the very powerful and very affluent. One example is when he's talking about Islam at a banquet at his uncle's table. He is talking about Islam and he asks, will anybody convert to Islam? And everybody's kind of quiet and nobody looks at him except for his young nephew Ali, who stands up at the age of 9 and says, I will convert to Islam, at which the entire table bursts into laughter because here is a child who is his only convert. So Muhammad's uncle eventually does die around 622, and Muhammad and his followers are forced to flee from Mecca. Now, prior to the death of Muhammad's uncle, Muhammad had been offered a position as an adjudicator, what was called at the time a judge in Yathrib. He hadn't taken up the offer while his uncle was alive, but after his uncle dies, this seems like a really attractive position because it would get him away from Mecca. In Medina, the prophet's role within the Muslim community changes. While he was in Mecca, he was purely a spiritual leader. He was absolutely along the same lines as, say, Buddha or Jesus or Krishna. He was very much a religious leader. Upon his arrival in Yathrib, however, he has to take on political responsibilities in a way that, say, other prophets had not, or other holy men had not. So he actually becomes kind of a political leader as well. Not only is he a judge in Medina, but he is also the leader of this band of refugees, about 1,000 followers who followed him to Yathrib. When Muhammad gets there, he attempts to essentially to cajole Jewish tribes into either accepting his message of Islam or at the very least tolerating him. So a lot of the Quran begins to take on revelations about where Muslims come from and where Arabs come from. For instance, Arabs trace their descent to Hagar and Ishmael, for instance, which to the Jewish people, those people are persona non grata, not terribly liked in the Old Testament. So that doesn't go over very well. Initially, Muslims prayed towards Jerusalem while they lived in Medina. It was considered the city of God. And Muslims also fasted on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, while living in Medina. This didn't really sit well with the very powerful and very insular Jewish tribes that were living in Yathrib. But most of the people got along fairly well in Yathrib, with the exception that there was some resentment because people coming from Mecca had no concept of how to live in a farming community. This leads to that very profound change in the Quran. Prior to the Hijra, what is called the Hijra, the retreat from Mecca, Islam is concerned with social change and righteous behavior. That's it. They're not talking about what to do in the case of a divorce, what to do in the case of a marital dispute, what to do about marriages or anything like that. They're not talking about the political arrangements. How should a government be run? After arriving in Medina, when Muhammad is put in charge of the city, he needs to really adopt some political and economic rules as well as moral ones. This becomes important because the first real document of Islam, the first real true written document of Islam, is not the Quran or the Hadith or the Surah, but rather a compact, or what is sometimes referred to as the Constitution of Medina, in which all tribes, regardless of faith, whether they are Christian or Jewish or Muslim, are accepted and promise to help support each other. In exchange, they get certain rights and certain privileges and that sort of thing. This is an important turn of events because shortly after the Prophet's tenure in Yathrib is challenged by the Qurayshi tribe, which wages war on Medina. The Qurayshi tribe is vastly stronger than the defenders at Medina, and so it's up to Muhammad to come up with some kind of new tricks to essentially stave off his imminent destruction. There's only a few thousand people defending the Medina, and there's tens of thousands of warriors trying to attack it. Every time Muhammad gets a victory, a seeming ingenious victory, it seems as if he is being guided by God, or that it seems like it was destined that God would allow this victory to happen. And so it erodes the confidence of the Qurayshi tribe, erodes the support of the Qurayshi tribe amongst other tribes, and begins to accrue, for better or for worse, some support for the Prophet Muhammad. Eventually, Muhammad garners enough support from these other tribes that he's able to return to Mecca in 631. This effectively begins what's called the Hajj pilgrimage, which then later becomes an integral part of the Muslim faith. Now, the modern Hajj and even the somewhat modern or semi-modern Hajj doesn't include the total walk from Medina back to Mecca, but it's a symbolic walk that starts about 10 kilometers outside of the city, and you walk through the desert together, regardless of station. This is to remind people of the origins of the religion. So Muhammad returns triumphant in 631 and begins to go about trying to set up a new Muslim community in the holy city of Mecca. At this point, we have the codification of the 5 quick and easy steps on how to become a Muslim. Converting to Islam is super easy. All you have to do is say in with a genuine heart and genuine belief that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger, and bang, you are technically a Muslim. But you also have some other things that you have to do. First, not only believing in a single God, but you also have to pray 5 times a day facing the direction of the holy city. After the return of the Prophet to Mecca, the prime holy city becomes Mecca. A good Muslim must give alms to the poor. You are required to give money to the poor and disenfranchised. This can be either direct money, or it can be services, or it can be favors, or shelter, or food, or whatever. A good Muslim must fast at the appointed time. It changes from Yom Kippur to the entire month of Ramadan. You don't eat from sunrise to sunset. You also don't drink, smoke, have sex, anything like that. And a good Muslim, of course, must make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their life. Now, this 5th pillar is kind of flexible. If you don't have the money to make it to Mecca, as long as you are willing and really want to go to Mecca, that counts too. So what's the major significance of these pillars, and why do they matter? Well, they reestablish this idea that Islam is a community. The idea that the rich need to help support the poor, and that all together, regardless of your station, you all do the exact same things. There are no different rules for the rich and the poor. In many ways, it is this kind of continuation of the rules under Judaism and Christianity, that we are all each other's brother, and that we are all each other's neighbor, and that we have a mitzvah or a commandment or a pillar that says we should take care of each other. So Muhammad, in his later years, marries a young girl, and this is the controversial part. She's 9 years old at the time, and her name is Aisha. And Aisha is the daughter of a man named Abu Bakr. And I know I haven't written Abi Bakr, but that's Arabic pronunciation, so we won't get into that. So he's 50. He marries a 9-year-old. Now, a lot of people use this as proof that Muhammad is like a pedophile, or that he's a disgusting monster, and therefore Islam is a corrupt religion. The reality is that this was a political marriage between the Abu Bakr and his backers, who are in the Qurayshi tribe, and Muhammad's family. And Aisha is not a typical wife. It's often referred to as his favorite wife, but that's because she is very feisty throughout the hadith and the surah. In fact, she is the source of many of these so-called hadiths, or traditions of the Prophet. She questions Muhammad about the Quran. Where does it come from? What does it mean? What does it mean for women? And that sort of thing. There was even a point at which, when she was older, that she was there was speculation that she was unfaithful to Muhammad, and this leads to a revelation, conveniently enough, in the Quran that says that if there is an accusation of infidelity, it has to be supported by 4 witnesses. So you have to basically have sex in front of an audience who are willing to tell people about it. Essentially, this is a way to shut down rumor mongering and baseless finger pointing. Unfortunately, it later on is corrupted and is applied more often to women than it is to men. In other words, women have to produce 4 witnesses, where men usually don't. So, best intentions, but sometimes the message gets garbled in the generations. Now, Muhammad dies only a year after returning to Mecca, and he leaves no successor. This is probably because he didn't expect to die at 60 years old. And so the questions of who will rule in his place, and who will govern the Arab people, and who will put down rebellions of tribes that have decided that they're no longer Muslim now that the Prophet has died, leads to the first advisory body, what's called a Shura Council. And the Shura Council is actually very democratic. Members of clans elect representatives who then go to the tribe, and they decide who will represent the tribe, and then the tribe gets together in a big body. The different tribes get together in a big body and elect a successor, or a Caliph Rasul Allah, successor to the messenger of God. And this is how the next leader of Islam was chosen. Now, there was a lot of controversy over this. The Rashidun, as they are known, the first four caliphs, sometimes referred to as the rightly guided caliphs. In other words, they were the ones who were elected by the Muslim body, and theoretically, at least, in the Sunni tradition, anybody can become a caliph. These Rashidun are basically drawn from people who were either old commanders or old friends of the prophets. The first the Rashidun was his friend and, weirdly enough, father-in-law Abu Bakr. They lead wars of consolidation in order to bring to heel some of these breakaway tribes. They even secure some of the kingdoms to the south, leading to the map that we see here. The caliphs had this large, unified, warlike force in the wake of this consolidation, so that by the time we get to about 652, they're itching for a fight. And who are they going to fight? Well, we've got the Sassanids and the Byzantines to the north. Now, here's the split. Remember how I said that there was a schism between Shia and Sunni almost right away? Well, the Sunni Muslims had elected Abu Bakr, whereas the party of Islam, the Shia Islam, the Shiat Ali, it really was a political split. They wanted the nephew, that 9-year-old who had grown up and become the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. They wanted Ali ibn Talib to be the leader. They wanted him to be the caliph. The Shia argue that bloodline and the mystic blessing of God is what should be leading the community of the faithful. On the other hand, the Sunni argued that it is in the Bedouin tradition, which a lot of the rules from the Quran are drawn directly from the Bedouin tradition. It is in the Bedouin tradition that when a sheikh dies without an heir, that the elders of the tribe get together and choose a new sheikh. So this consensus is somewhat democratic. Politically speaking, the Sunni and the Shia are at each other's throats. There's this religious political leadership that's kind of in question with the Sunni. The early dynasties, for example, are established in the wake of assassinations. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, he dies of old age. He's not too much younger than the Prophet Muhammad, but his successors are assassinated, particularly Ali himself, who becomes the fourth rightly guided caliph eventually. But even within Shia Islam, there's this tradition of rebellion. Even those who initially had supported Ali then decided that he wasn't worthy, so-called Kharijites. And of course, there's this tradition of martyrdom, or this remembrance of martyrdom. The son of Ali, a man named whoops, can't forget it. I forgot his name for a moment there. Let's see. Well, anyway, the Hussein. I'm sorry. There we are. Hussein's death at the Battle of Karbala as a result of political trickery, and it essentially ends, for all intents and purposes, the direct bloodline of Ali. There's some obscure other cousins and that sort of thing, and daughters, and some very questionable bloodlines that persist all the way into the modern period. But the direct male bloodline is essentially ended in a battle at Karbala, only a few decades after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Regardless of this schism, regardless of that, there is this huge push into the surrounding territories, and the conquest of these Muslims are surprisingly fast. And they begin to integrate a bunch of disparate people and belief systems into what is largely referred to as an Arab empire. It's really difficult to distinguish what are true Arabs from pretender Arabs. The so-called non-Arab Muslim clients, the Mawali, are considered themselves Arab within a few decades. They start pretending that they're Arab, or at least start considering themselves Arab, not, I shouldn't say pretending. The Persians who are conquered consider themselves equal or better than the Arabs. The Greco-Romans are the same. And even along North Africa, the so-called Berbers, even though they eventually acquiesce to the conquest and many of them convert to Islam, they continue to defy a lot of the central authority in the caliphate. So essentially what we have here is the armies come out of the Arabian Peninsula and push in towards the centers of civilization. Eventually they topple the Sassanid Persians and are stopped by the Byzantines, but that just means they have to move westward along the northern coast of Africa. When they eventually get to what is now modern-day Morocco, they decide to turn north, for they see this, the Rock of Gibraltar, which actually is Jabal al-Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. The Tariq is the Muslim general in charge of this massive army that is going across North Africa. They reach the very end of North Africa. They have a desert to their left, an ocean in front of them, and to their right is this very thin, barely even 7-mile wide channel that leads eventually to Spain. The invasion of Spain happens in 711, so within 100 years, well within 100 years of the death of the Prophet, Islam has spread all the way into Europe. In 711, the conquest of Spain is ended, and this begins 7 centuries of influence on the art, language, architecture, trade, and philosophy and science of Spain, which then also begins to filter into Europe as well. And it's actually kind of a good deal to be living in Spain at this time. In the 9th century, in Cordoba, for example, in the southern part of Spain, there's about 500,000 residents, there's public baths, there's about 7 miles of public lighting, there are open schools, and Christians and Jews are allowed to practice their religion within certain boundaries, even though there is a Muslim majority. Now compare this to someplace like London at about the same time. At about 900 of the current era, there's about maybe 8,000 residents. There are no baths. There's very little lighting. Most of it is just personal lighting. There are no schools except monasteries. Of course, you have to put up with good old Viking raids. And of course, the Christians are very intolerant of non-Christian religions.